time the wrong way. I didn't start that way. It's not a very good way to start. Anyway, I am Jody Keever, and I'm here on behalf of the trustees of Friends of Boston Museum, which they've all conveyed their gratitude for this opportunity to share some information. I'm not going to be speaking for very long, because really Paul is the billing for the evening. But the Friends of Boston Museum is a charity that has benefited greatly from something called the Cultural Protection Fund. And you can see a little summary of sort of the timeline of it all. But really, it comes back to 2008. And some of you maybe remember what was going on in Boston in those days. It wasn't a very happy time. And the then Major General who was going out to Boston came to the British Museum and said, what can we do? How can we help cultural heritage in Boston? And as a result of that meeting with Dr. John Curtis and then Neil McGregor, who many of you know, they identified the possibility of doing a survey of the various sites in the South and then also of the museums. Now, one would like to think that there would be lots of money forthcoming. Of course, there wasn't. A Major Hugo Clark was assigned to be the project manager. And at the time, Katan Al-Abid was a young Iraqi member of the State Board of Antiquities and Heritage who was the director of the Boston Museum. Of course, there were no objects in the museum, there was nothing there, but he was the director, and he is actually an extraordinary man who is still to this day, as you can see, involved. So as a result of that conversation, there were various visits. Paul was on many of them, and the British Museum did not take on the mantle of being the project director for this, nor in the end, of course, the military left in 2009. So was there money to do this project that they had identified? What happened is a group of people identified this particular building, which is the Lakeside Palace, built by Saddam Hussein in the early 90s. And in the early 90s, he was trying to woo many governments. This actually was given to King Hussein of Jordan. Many people don't know that little tidbit. I just learned that last October. I think it's fascinating. But as a result, this building was identified, and it wasn't until 2009 in July that Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki did agree that this building could be the new Basra Museum. This is a national museum. It is not a private museum. We are just a charity that was eventually set up to try and help this project come to fruition. So as a result of those early days, when the army left and the building was identified, no money, what do you do? A group of people here, including Dr. John Curtis and Sir Terence Clark, put together a small charity called the Friends of Boston Museum to try and raise money for this project. Some of you, if you raise money for Iraq, will know that that is not a very easy thing to do. So they were only able to raise what should have been $3 million. They raised about $600,000. What do you do with that? The trustees were very smart. They decided at a certain period of time that it would be better to just go ahead and start the project. Because once you have something started, people have something to look at. So as a result, since I don't have a computer, I'm doing this on my iPad, sorry. As a result of that, they contracted it with Reyer, which is a company in Germany that Katan Al-Abid, who was the director, had identified for museum cases, and they decided to start what was called the Basra Gallery, to bring items from Basra, from the Basra region, southern Iraq, to basically get started. The building itself still has a lot of work, but in 2016, when the opening happened, we didn't get to go upstairs, and it was just as well I didn't know about it. Because at that same time as we had the opening, we had just applied for a brand new Cultural Protection Fund scheme, which is the grants that your taxpayer money goes to, a £30 million pot of funds, and now it's in its third year. They're just finishing up some grants. And 250 people applied, so we didn't have much hope. When we were at the opening, I kept saying, well, we must plan things, and John would say, we're not going to get the money. Well, we were very lucky that we did in December, but we still have a long way off. So at this opening, you can see John Curtis on the left-hand side. You can see people in the middle. I think you can see Eleanor and a couple other people in this picture. I guess I know the right picture. And the person in green is Maysoon al-Damlouchi, who's an MP and very involved in cultural heritage matters and on the committee of the Iraqi Parliament for Culture. at the museum. Paul will be filling you more in on this. We combined the idea of having an international workshop with Eleanor and John Curtis and Paul were all spearheading, and the British Institute for the Study of Iraq organized that. It was 2 days. It was really a unique experience. People in Basra had not been used to international scholars coming there, meeting with them, having them talk, listening to them, and actually having that engagement, and it was a tremendous thing. On the left-hand side, oops, next one, sorry, you can see or not. So left-hand side, you have all of us who were part of the workshop. At the opening, Eleanor Robson, who was our chair at the time, and many other people involved in Basra work and Southern Iraq were in that. On the right-hand side, we're on the top of the building of the old Basra Museum, which is in the, not old Basra, but is in the, where the heritage buildings are. The building was deemed not to be an appropriate building for a museum with international objects of high value, shall we say. But they still use it now for the heritage and Basra, antiquities it's called. On the right-hand side, you see this Basrawi lady. She is a professor at the University of Basra and has just been our BISI scholar. And she was a David Dangor scholar and was at the McDonald Institute. And we thank everybody who made her possible. So these are just a few pictures from the event itself, two-day workshop. On the left-hand side, we have Robert Killick, who is part of the Karak Swasinu survey project. And at that point in time, I did not know, because we were all being very hush-hush. They had also applied for a grant, and they also received the money in December. So we did celebrate slightly at the House of Lords at the name drop. But it was an amazing, amazing experience for both projects, because without that money, neither project would go through. The person on the right that you see with Eleanor Robson presenting BISI books, not only is she giving the books, but we're making a major announcement that the library of the British Institute for the Study of Iraq, which was the British School of Archaeology of Iraq, is being given to the Basra Museum for their library. There's still a lot of work to do. A building has to be, the room has to be kitted out, lots of funds have to be found, but we're working on that. And you see John Curtis in the foreground and Paul is in the background. Sorry, I shouldn't be doing this. So you have the Indiana Jones moment for Paul. The joy of going was meeting the Iraqi colleagues, then going with them to war, to Ziggurat, and that was absolutely fabulous. It was a life, bucket list type thing. And then we also got to see where Woolley had his camp. And I know that Ziggurat is amazing, but there were many people there who were working on the Woolley material. They were pretty excited to go to the camp as well. Really, the main purpose of our grant, which is, by the way, £500,000, is to pay for these beautiful cases. This was the first gallery, the Basra Gallery. It is a haven of beauty in Basra. Basra still has many ways to go to an uplift, shall we say, to sort of more attractive modernity, but it's working on it. There are wonderful artists, there are wonderful scholars who work there. But this is a haven. You walk in and it is very beautiful. And there will be 3 more galleries that will be just as beautiful. And they will be the Assyrian, Babylonian, and Sumerian gallery. We will be using many international scholars, including Paul, amongst others, to help us on some of the labeling. But already right now you have these wonderful little school groups coming, you get university groups coming, you have festivities going on there that are just incredible. They had 600 people there a week ago Friday for a festival of civilization. And this is all down to Katan al-Adin. So in January we had a training program. Paul was the lead trainer, I was the organizer. We also had Dr. Nora Al-Gailani of the Glasgow Museums, Dr. Ulrika Al-Khamis of the Abu Khan Museum, previously the Sharjah Museum, and Lamia Al-Gailani, who's one of our major, also trustee, but also involved with the British Institute for the Study of Iraq. She was also very, very involved in this project. I have the report here afterwards if anybody wants to look at it. It is on our website. Almost all this information that I've given you tonight is on our website. At the end of the training, it was 6 intensive days, and we really did pack it in. And there is no doubt that more training is needed. Our money won't cover that. Hopefully wonderful programs like the British Museum's International Training Program will be part of the long-term project, because help will be required. But this was a wonderful start, and on the left-hand side you can see Paul and Nora with Ali Kader, who's our BISI Executive Officer, in fact. He was there for the evaluation and also just to help them generally organizing the program. This was the first time they had been on a training program where they were being actively engaged with. And we did actually listen to them as well as learn from them. We have learned that there are many challenges. This is not going to be an easy project throughout Iraq, but this is the start. And they actually did listen and they did talk, and we talked amongst each other because there were people from the Basra Museum, and what was truly amazing is there are now many volunteers. I won't let us take credit for this. You know, the Cultural Protection Fund wants us to bring volunteers to this museum. They brought the volunteers to the museum. We've helped them create a museum, but we have not done anything to, create the vibrancy that he has brought to this museum. So the group on the left, I'm not quite sure, they are an NGO that had actually been around for a while, but right now they've also just established a new Iraqi Friends of Basra Museum. They have over 40 volunteers. They even help cleaning, they help setting things up, they help with events. It's really quite extraordinary. But now the hard work begins. This year is our last year. March 2019, we have to have everything finished. And when we will not be able to accomplish all that we need to do by the end of this year. Basra Gallery has objects in it. Information is now being collected from Baghdad on that. Dr. Lamia Garlani Ware, along with a committee from Basra and Baghdad, are putting together the objects. The State Board of Antiquities and Heritage has agreed that all the objects that were in the original Basra Museum will all come back to Basra. Now, whether they are fit for purpose, because they've been in trunks since 1991, will be something interesting, including ideas, by the way. So we'll see, but as a result of that, we are hoping to obtain enough information, and we will have to be relying on international scholars to help us with some of this, shall we say, labeling and displays and things like that. And hopefully Paul will be part of that, but Noor Al-Adilani has agreed to come back in October and November. Paul and I have talked about this. So I'm going to end, and before I pass on to Paul, to say that obviously it's a great joy to go to Basra. I've only been there now 3 times. It is a special joy to get to the marshes, which are actually being rejuvenated, and Paul will talk more about that. But these projects could not be done without the dynamism and dedication of Katan al-Rabi, who we see here in the cap. He also was very, very involved in the listing of the UNESCO World Heritage for Southern Iraq, for both the marshes and the 3 sites. He is learning to say no, but he doesn't say no very much. And as a result, this project and this museum can go forward as a hub of cultural activity in Basra. And I'm going to turn on to telling stories in Basra further to Paul, who's been very involved in this project from the very beginning. So he has actually probably more to tell than I do.
Well, thank you, Joan. That wonderful survey of the work of the Friends of Basra Museum. I'm thrilled to be here this evening in this joint lecture between the British Institute for the Study of Iraq, of which I'm currently the chair of trustees, and the Friends of Basra Museum. And of course, it's huge thanks to the MBI Al-Jaber Foundation for hosting the event and inviting me to talk this evening. So thank you very much to them. What I want to do this evening is really think about museums in Iraq broadly, using the story of the redevelopment, the reopening of Basra Museum as it were as a background. So many of the stories that you've heard from Joan, I'll be revisiting, so there will be a lot of overlap, but I want to put it into a broader context, to just think more about what we mean about museums, especially in Iraq, in a post-conflict situation. So, telling stories in Basra is really about telling stories in Iraq, and how those might go about being achieved. These images now, I think, beginning to become familiar to you through what Joan has already talked about, this extraordinary building in Basra. Beautiful displays, lots of interesting objects, lots of visitors now going through the doors. But it's worth emphasizing that the museum is run by the Iraqi State Board of Antiquities and Heritage, the SBAH. They manage the national heritage sites and the national museums of Iraq. So the Basra Museum is very much part of something bigger. And the story of its redevelopment, as I suggested, it really provides an opportunity to explore the role and purpose of museums in Iraq. Now, of course, museums in the Middle East are now being seen very much as an essential part of a modern country. Vast amounts of money, and I mean enormous amounts of money, have been spent over the recent decades on extraordinary architecture and indeed the contents to fill those buildings. So here, for example, in these images in the UAE, you'll be familiar, I'm sure, with the opening of the Louvre Abu Dhabi, whereas in Qatar, the Museum of Islamic Art, a very dramatic image. And modern countries in the Middle East, as indeed around the world, see museums as an essential component of what it is to be modern and international and global. The question I want to raise really is, what do we mean by a national museum, which of course Basra Museum is claiming to be part of. They are national monuments and are often intended to tell national stories. But what do we mean by those national stories? Whose stories are they actually? Who is telling those stories? How are they constructed? Who are the audiences that are intended to understand those stories or explore those stories? And how are those audiences encouraged to come into the museum? Now, those sorts of questions are being asked by museums around the world on a daily basis. But they're particularly important questions to ask for Iraq in a post-conflict situation. What does a national story look like? And who is telling that story? I'm not going to answer those questions this afternoon, but what I want to do in exploring the museums of Iraq is ask who should be telling those stories and suggest some ideas. So, let's start by, I think we can really only understand, begin to answer or explore those questions by thinking about the long history of museums in Iraq. And that story, I think, really begins with the British occupation of Iraq. And that occupation, or invasion and occupation, I'm talking about is not 2003, but, of course, 1917, when the British forces invaded the territory which then was, at least nominally, under the control of the Ottoman Empire. And in the top of the slide, you can see a photograph of the entry of General Maude, who was leading British forces in the region, into Baghdad in March 1917. Now, within a very short time after the British had occupied Baghdad, Maude issued a proclamation to regulate the preservation of archaeological sites and the antiquities trade. It was high on the agenda. And he promised high penalties to anybody desecrating an ancient monument. Now, as suggested by the photograph at the bottom of the slide, where British officers are visiting the site of Babylon in 1918, the heritage of this region, the Sumerians, Babylonians, the Assyrians, had been claimed by the West since the mid-19th century through major excavations in the region. The British, for example, at Nimrud, filling the British Museum with Assyrian reliefs. The French at sites in southern Iraq, filling the Louvre with the monuments of the Sumerians. And for those European powers, and indeed Americans as well, who were also excavating places like Nippur in southern Iraq, they used the evidence to fill in their own cultural identity. The Middle East, the heritage of the Middle East, heritage of this region, became tied to the notion of the roots of Western civilization. That was transported to them through the Old Testament and through the Greeks. And as a result, the antiquities of this region were tied very much to Western identity, and they wanted to take ownership of it. Now, of course, as you will all know, following the First World War, Britain was granted mandate control of Mesopotamia by the Allied victors after the First World War. And after a major rebellion against the British occupation in 1920, the British decided the best way to move forward was to create a kingdom of Iraq. And so the country of Iraq was established. Modern borders, in fact, drawn in the sand, and Iraq came into being. And so a kingdom of Iraq was created, but under British administration in 1921. I put up this rather lovely Ottoman stamp, which has been overstamped with British occupation, just to be absolutely certain that people are aware who was actually in control. During this period, 1920s, 1920, 1921, already British and American museums and universities were applying pressure to send expeditions to excavate in Iraq. And shortly after signing of the Anglo-Iraq Treaty of 1922, a Department of Antiquities was established in the country to help facilitate that activity. Now, a British administrator was appointed as honorary director of the Department of Antiquities. So again, in the Kingdom of Iraq, but it was a British official who was appointed to run the Department of Antiquities. And she will be, I'm sure, a familiar name to you all, Gertrude Bell. Of course, a very famous traveller through the Middle East, a writer, popular writer describing her travels, and an archaeologist who had explored and investigated sites from Turkey through Iraq. And she had been seconded into the effectively civil service of Iraq during the war and had been appointed as Oriental Secretary after the war. And she was now appointed by the new King of Iraq, King Faisal, as the honorary director of antiquities. And if you wanted to contact her, all you needed to do was send a telegram to Antiquity, Baghdad. That was enough. And she would be able to get the information. Almost immediately, in 1922, she started to draft a new antiquities law. Now, before that law was even passed, foreign expeditions started to enter Iraq. A couple of examples here, some of those famous ones. In 1922, there on the right-hand side of the slide, those two images show the excavations at the site of Ur in southern Iraq. led of course by Leonard Woolley. A long campaign, 1922 to 1934, and paralleling it here on the left, images from the excavations at Kish, to the north of Ur, and nonetheless on the vast alluvial plains of southern Iraq. A decade of work there from 1923 to 1933. Now, those images immediately, I think the thing that impresses me at least when I look at them, is the vast number of people employed in digging vast holes in the ground. And of course, all those people are Iraqis, but they are not in any position of authority. They're not being given ownership of the sites. It is, after all, their site. They are simply toiling away at the behest of the field directors, who are the European powers, effectively. There was no thought to involve them in anything more than this labour. There was no thought to invest, for example, in training or giving them their own voice. It was not about them. It was about these excavations acquiring material to bring back to the museums of their home countries, to continue that notion of filling in the gaps of their own roots, cultural roots. Now, of course, by 1923, as these excavations started digging these vast holes in the ground, the antiquities started piling up, and something had to be done about them. And so Gertrude Bell managed to convince the administration in Baghdad to give her a room in one of the government offices as a museum. So we now have the first museum in Iraq. It's a room in a government building, which is effectively filled with vast numbers of objects that are coming out of the ground as a result of these excavations. In the same year, 1923, Bell amended her will. And this, I think, gives you a sense of the challenges that she was facing as an individual. On the one hand, she was creating a museum, the heritage of Iraq, for the kingdom of Iraq, thinking perhaps of the future. But on the other hand, she amended her will to leave £6,000 to the British Museum to establish a British Iraq School of Archaeology. She wanted the British to remain there and dig, investing in the future of Britain as much as in the future of Iraq. The law that she was constructing around antiquities was finally passed in June 1924. And it was a law that was extremely generous towards foreign archaeologists. It allowed them to receive a substantial share of the artifacts uncovered and to export that share abroad. Which is why now, if you come to the Ashmolean Museum, I am the curator of a collection from Kish, which originates from this excavation. And it represents our most important source of understanding Mesopotamia in Oxford. If you go across the road to the British Museum, of course you will see the share from the excavations at Ur and the famous royal graves. So this is very much a product of this time when European and American powers really controlled the heritage of the Kingdom of Iraq. Now, of course, these sorts of excavations inevitably produce many, many more objects, as they do. They continue to come out of the ground in vast numbers, and here, 40 pots in the dig house at Ur just gives you a sense of the volume. And of course, that little office in the government building became full. And so Gertrude Bell continued to pressure for a larger building. And eventually, she found one, or at least was given one. She wrote to her mother, and I quote, "It will be a real museum, rather like the British Museum, only a little smaller." That was her dream. That was the aspiration. Now, of course, it was furnished exclusively from these European and North American excavations. They really had no interest in the Islamic empires of Iraq's history. It was all about that deep heritage of Iraq, which again tied in with those Western notions of their cultural roots. And in 1926, one room in that new building was opened. And here it is, the Baghdad Museum, located in the North Bridge Street of Baghdad. And that one room was opened by King Faisal on the 14th of June, 1926. A month later, perhaps because she felt her work had been completed, Gertrude Bell was dead from an overdose. Her legacy, however, was really felt within this building in Baghdad, the first substantial museum for Iraq. And 4 years later, in 1930, a commemorative bronze plaque was unveiled by King Faisal, as you see here, naming one of the wings of the museum in honour of Gertrude Bell. 2 years after that event, that legacy that Bell had left in her will became a reality, and in 1932, the British School of Archaeology in Iraq was established. So a museum was in place, but the British were still there, institutionally, to excavate. The first president of the British School was Max Mallowan, accompanied here by his wife Agatha Christie, having a conversation with Leonard Woolley, still digging at Ur. So really very much of that sort of, at least from a British perspective, a sort of rather romantic moment in terms of archaeology. Death in Mesopotamia, as Agatha Christie would have it. Now, after the British formally withdrew from Iraq that same year in 1932, we start to see the Iraqis themselves beginning to claim their heritage. The former education minister, Sati al-Busri, became the first Iraqi director of general antiquities, and he started to revise Bell's antiquities laws in Iraq's favours. And only now we start to see Iraqi-led excavations carried out, and their focus was actually on the classical Islamic sites, which have been largely ignored by the European and American excavations. And so we see excavations at Wasit, Samarra, and Abbasid monuments across Baghdad were restored. The museum that al-Busri had inherited from Bell and her successors looked like this. And in many ways, if you compare the interior of the museums and the layout of the museums, it looked very much like the British Museum did in the 1930s. Crammed with objects, cases, filling galleries, very little labelling. Labelling on the whole either had to be typed out or handwritten, which was slow and expensive. And so you tended to rely, just as you did in the British Museum at this date, on guidebooks, which were effectively just lists of the objects. They provided some historical context, but you needed it to really make sense of this dense display of material. In the British Museum, you had a notion of a 19th century progression of civilization in the layout of the galleries. In the Iraq Museum, it was just stuff with things. There was no real narrative. You just were surrounded by antiquity. And those challenges meant that Busri and his successors began to think about planning for a larger and more accessible Iraq Museum. Now that only became possible in the realities after the Second World War. when Iraq increasingly presented itself as a modernist state, but one that was built on a deep antiquity. They began to see their heritage as part of a national story. And a new museum was planned, designed, and established, and opened in 1966. This is I'm showing stamps, I'm not a philatelist, but it's an interesting way of capturing moments when states express their interests. And this stamp showing, interestingly, reconstruction of the headdress from the royal graves at Ur, the sort of display actually you would see in Philadelphia or the British Museum, being used to celebrate the inauguration of this new museum. Here's some images of that new building from the 1970s in glorious Technicolor. It is an extraordinary modernist building, and in many ways the interior and the design and display inside the building was cutting edge for its day. The story was told now in accompanying books in Arabic, not just through English language lists. Here's the Iraq Museum guidebook, celebrating that 1966 opening. And you have a description of the museum and its history and the objects it placed in a wider context. The story that was told in the museum now had a narrative. It told the story of Iraq's past from Neolithic times through the galleries to the glories of Abbasid Baghdad. And the designs were open and allowed circulation of objects. You can see the cases in the bottom there, minimal and look almost quite modern. Indeed, in enormous contrast to something like the British Museum of the state, which retained its post-Second World War density before it too started to think about access to objects more creatively. So it was an extraordinary moment for Iraq, and as I say, really demonstrated an interest in tying their culture to a national story. In the same period, the 1970s, we see the expansion of that heritage through the country. The oil boom of the 1970s and the 1980s brought huge amounts of, huge increase in budget and weight to the State Board of Antiquities, and regional museums were established, and then was sent from Baghdad a core group of material which expressed that national story. So in a sense, the same type of range of objects, enabling that same narrative to be told from Erbil in the north of Iraq, all the way down to Basra in the south. So a sense of national identity being imposed from the centre through these provincial museums. And Basra was there with it. This is the Ottoman building dating to the early 20th century. That was the original Basra Museum. As Joe mentioned, now restored and serving as offices for the State Board. Extraordinary building and a very beautiful one. So Iraq's heritage spread across the country, a narrative, single narrative being shared. And then, of course, came the disasters of the 1990s until more recent times, decades of conflict and sanctions. The disasters of the first Gulf War in 1990 resulted in many provincial museums being looted. Shia uprisings in the spring of 1991 led to the looting of the Basra Museum and the Mosul Museum. They're on the left-hand side of the slide, the two ends of the country, and those museums were effectively shut. Basra, among them, that old Ottoman building emptied and left to go to decay. The Iraq Museum too closed to the public, so Iraq's heritage was being closed off. Of course, it wasn't just the lack of access to the heritage that resulted from these conflicts. The museum staff suffered. They didn't have work, their previous work was ignored, and they suffered, as the rest of the population did, in the sanctions that were imposed on the country. The Second Gulf War of 2003 brought yet more misery to an already miserable situation, where famously, of course, you see the looting of the Iraq Museum, and again, Mosul Museum is ransacked. Again, the decades of work by the Iraqi staff trashed, lost, and their livelihoods destroyed. That same series of wars and sanctions also resulted in the closure of the British School of Archaeology's premises in Baghdad. Fieldwork had come to an end, and without a presence in the country, the UK government stopped funding the British school. As a result of those changes, the school came to the decision to reinvent itself, and in 2007 it established itself as a charity under the name the British Institute for the Study of Iraq. Without government funding, it now extended its academic coverage to support the study of Iraq from prehistoric times to the present, not just interested in antiquity, as it had been founded in the 30s. It now looked at Iraq's history very broadly, and its principal purpose was to find ways to support colleagues in Iraq through issuing grants for research on the country, field work in neighbouring countries, and bringing scholars from Iraq, where possible, to this country to share knowledge. And it's in that environment of 2007 that we see the development of the interest in a new museum for Basra. A story that you've heard from Joan, but I'll just repeat some of what she had to say to place it into this context of the development of the changes happening in Iraq in terms of its heritage. So, as you've heard, it really was the initiative of a number of people, led initially by Lieutenant General Barney White Spunner, who you can see here, with a glass of white wine in his hand. He had been appointed Commander-in-Chief of British troops in Iraq. Southern Iraq, remember, was occupied by the British forces in 2003. He was General Officer commanding the multinational division Southeast, a powerful position. And he was due to be deployed to Iraq in February 2008. And he was anxious to know, I think he was keen to leave a positive legacy after a rather series of problematic years. He was anxious to know what he might do to help protect Iraqi cultural heritage, which of course had suffered terribly in the previous decade. And a meeting was arranged at the British Museum with Neil MacGregor, who has the other glass of wine in his hand, and Dr. John Curtis, who was then the keeper of the Middle East Department, standing here. They, as you heard from Joan, decided that an inspection of the archaeological sites would be useful to see what damage had occurred. And White Spunner appointed Major Hugo Clark, who's standing here between me and John, as the manager of the project. Now, once in Basra, Clark recognised that for security reasons, as much as anything, the focus should be on establishing a new museum. And so he found the director of the museum, who had been appointed by the State Board, and Katan Al-Abid was the man. I should also point out here another individual who played a significant role in the development of the Basra Museum and its story is Qais Hussein Rashid, standing in suit in that image, who was at the time director of excavations for the State Board and is now the director of the State Board as a whole. So an important man whose contribution to the story should be mentioned. Now, as Joan has pointed out, a palace of Saddam Hussein, known as the Lakeside Palace, was adopted by the British Army engineers as the best candidate for the museum, and by 2009, the Iraqi Prime Minister and the Basra Provincial Council had agreed that indeed it would be the new museum. And as Joan has said already, this really is the result of the hard work of Katan Al-Abid. With no prospect of British government funding, the Friends of Basra Museum was established under the chairmanship of Sir Terence Clark, previous ambassador to Iraq, to raise the funds. Slow, hard work, but by 2015 it became apparent that the money that had been promised from the Basra Provincial Council wasn't going to be forthcoming, and so the Friends of Basra Museum decided, as you've heard, to open one gallery in the museum. Here we have some more images of the opening with the director of the museum showing high-profile Iraqis around. Some individuals who helped make the museum possible. It was really very much a local development. Mahdi Al-Sawi here, who managed the renovation, became sort of a media star, I think, as a result of showing what he had achieved. And we now have this extraordinary building and one gallery. Now, during all that time, as the museum is being developed, it's not just in Basra that Iraq's heritage is being as it were, brought back to life. There's a plan of the museum, and as of course Joan has already talked about, there's now funding to move towards opening 2 other galleries. The Iraq Museum was also officially reopened in 2015. There have been a series of openings over the years before that, but officially reopened to the public in 2015. It too, of course, was faced by the same sorts of questions that I asked at the start of the talk. With support from the Italian government, many of the galleries have been refurbished, but in reality, they don't look dramatically different than that image I showed you of the galleries from the 1966 building. Museums in cases, beautifully lit, with some text panels and labelling, but the narrative is effectively the same, and there's no other voice, no other sense of engagement. So we're left with museums really without stories. And that brings me really to the sense of how we might think about how those stories might be created and who should be responsible for that. And this is a useful way, I think, of thinking about it, in that, of course, in all of this, the focus has been on the objects and on heritage, but there hasn't been on those people who are coming into the museum, the local communities. How do they inherit it? How do they appreciate and care for it? And the heritage cycle is one way of thinking how that might be achieved. So in order to value your past, and this applies to everyone, how you value your past, you need to care for it. So museums, heritage sites, they provide a sense of enjoyment, which provides a sense of understanding, and through understanding you come to value it, and so on, in a circle. Usually understanding is a good place to start. And once you have a sense of understanding, you can then begin to value it and move forward. This sort of thinking has arisen in the decades when Iraq and its museum and heritage professionals were isolated from the world. They haven't been part of that narrative. They haven't been engaged in that thinking. So for modern museums, we've been thinking about identity and history. Whose stories are we telling? The multiple communities in everybody's location. Whose voice are we listening to, and how is that being told? Some examples. This is a display from Chicago where it lists all the various groups that you could talk about in Iran. Are those whose communities are being expressed in the national story of the museum? Techniques of telling those stories, of course, are being explored and developed in museums over the last 20 years or so. Interpretive methods of engaging with objects. Storytelling, particularly, is now crucial in terms of museum displays. They're not objects isolated from any context. They're woven into stories. How is the best way of telling that? No Iraqis have the opportunity to be part of those discussions. And how do you engage communities in their local museums? Through their sense of ownership, either through membership schemes or indeed simply through branding, which makes it clear that the museum is theirs. And again, museums in the rest of the world have been grappling with these questions, and are still grappling with them, as I try to help to do in Oxford on a regular basis. Again, our colleagues in Iran have been completely removed from these discussions for 30 years, that crucial time has been happening. So to end, I just want to talk about a scheme which we hope will begin to perhaps help in this area. And this is the so-called MapBrain network, run out of UCL by Professor Eleanor Robson. I'd like to say to the audience here. I'm working with Eleanor on this project, which is aimed, as you see, to encourage the sustainable development of antiquity and cultural heritage. Funded through the AHRC, the Arts, Humanities and Research Council, so it's a UK government funding in their Global Challenges Research Fund. And they've provided funds, so UCL, Oxford, and University of Kurdistan research project with the aim of finding out the background to that exclusion by Iraqi academics from the wider community, and finding ways to overcome that by giving them a voice, helping them to re-engage with all those questions that I ask, and contribute to that discussion. We can do that through partnerships across Iraq. Those highlighted in blue are our current partners who are joining with us to join with partners in the UK. So research projects that are about Iraq, for Iraq, by Iraqis can happen about their heritage. How are we doing that? Well, we've got a visiting scholarship scheme extending the British Institute's already existing scholarship scheme to bring colleagues to this country, again, to share their experiences with us, but also for them to engage with research here before perhaps returning to Iraq and applying for one of our large grants. And we have grants up to £100,000 which can enable academics in Iraq to re-engage with thinking about their heritage and then putting into practice techniques for understanding and engaging with the local community. So this is really all about local stories for local people. And I want to end with a recent initiative that's come out of the NARU network, which really, I think, sums up what we're hoping to achieve more broadly in the sorts of projects. This was a workshop which Eleanor led in Baghdad at the so-called station, cultural metro, exploring the idea of cultural heritage perceptions from Iraqi youths. So a room filled with young, dynamic thinkers of Baghdad. What does heritage mean to them, and how do they want to engage with it? And some really interesting thoughts came out immediately from that one workshop. And again, my thanks to Eleanor for sort of summarising this very neatly for me to copy from her tweet.
Which is what I'm doing now.
Oh, very good. Thank you very much. Quote yourself. For them, heritage begins at home, not at school. It's that emotional connection that's important. It can also be learned in adulthood, so that's an important thing. They are very concerned that their heritage is being obliterated by perhaps modernity in that sense, deliberate erasure of the past. I don't mean in terms of Daesh, ISIS, I mean just simply by modern development and a country eager to build and expand. But there is a clear understanding that this heritage is important as a living experience, not just something for tourists, not just something for visitors, whether Iraqi or international. So their questions were, how do you find new ways to educate, captivate, and energize young Iraqis and indeed old Iraqis in their heritage, both at home and at school? What are the methods? So they're asking the same questions now that we're asking around the world in other places. And I hope that through projects like this and through the initiative of a new Basra Museum, we're establishing spaces and opportunities where Iraqis can re-engage with the wider community and with the sorts of questions that will be asked globally about heritage and contribute and shape their own future.